Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first III Inequalities Seminar of the winter term 2025. Welcome to those online as well. I'm Francisco Ferreira, and I'm very happy to be chairing today's seminar with Olivier Sterck. Olivier is a associate professor of economics at both Antwerp and Oxford, and is also a lead economist at the Refugee Economist Program at the Refugee Studies Center. I've worked with Olivier before, so I have to say he's an incredibly creative guy, and I'm really excited about today's seminar, which is Poverty Without Poverty Line. You'll speak for the usual 45 minutes or so, and there'll be time for questions afterwards, but I think he's happy to take clarifying questions in between as well as for standard econ. So over to you, Olivier. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation. And of course, feel free to interrupt me during the presentation if something needs to be clarified. Today, I'll present a paper which is called Poverty Without Poverty Line, but it's actually a combination of papers that I will present today. One with many co-authors from the World Bank, and then one single author paper. We can find both online, of course. And in this paper, what we try to do is to introduce a new measure which can be used to measure poverty and welfare, and can be adapted to measure also inequality. And so today I will introduce you to this measure. But before introducing you to the measure, I first need to explain why it is important actually to build a new measure. Because as you know, there are already plenty of measures of poverty, measure of welfare, measure of inequality. So do we need one more measure? And if yes, why would we need new measures? And basically in this table, what we try to do is to assess which measure are actually existing, but which measure especially are used both by academia, in policy, and in public discourse. And what we see is that by far the most widely used poverty measures and welfare measures are the poverty rate, not surprisingly, and average income. Okay, all other measures are almost never used in comparison to these standard indicators. But one problem is that, as you may know, the poverty rate and the average income have four properties. And one key property that these indicators does not have is to be sensitive to income distribution, to be distribution sensitive. What does it mean? It means that they do not give more weight to the poorest of the poor. In technical terms, they do not satisfy the transfer axiom. If you transfer money from someone with low income to someone with a higher income, in theory, you expect that poverty should increase. That's not the case with average income, and that's not the case for the poverty rate if no one is crossing the poverty line. So these measures are not distribution sensitive, which is a key property that you would want for poverty measure, yet they are widely used. Why are they widely used? Is because they are super intuitive, they are super easy to understand, they are super simple to be able to convey information to the public, information to policymakers. And of course, academics are aware of the shortcoming of this measure, and they try to propose better measure of poverty and inequality that are distribution sensitive. And you have some examples in this table, but these measures are not widely used. Why? We argue it's because they are basically often too complex, their units are not intuitive, their interpretation is not intuitive, and so they are not widely used by this broad range of actors. And so basically the purpose of our research is to construct an indicator that is both intuitive and has nice properties, including being distribution sensitive, and none of the measures that are listed here, and none of the measures that we reviewed can actually do that. So that's motivating our research. That's what I've just said, but in more complicated terms. So that's the structure of the talk today. Basically, I will first introduce you the new distribution sensitive index. I will explain the intuition, and I explain why it's good to use this indicator, because it's intuitive, it's empirically grounded, it has interesting properties, and it's relevant for policy. I will also show how we can modify this index to measure inequality. Then I'll show an application using World Bank data to see how welfare, poverty, and inequality have evolved over time since the 1990s, and then I'll conclude by explaining some limitation and some pathways to generalize the measure for future research. So, actually, this research started just after I worked with Chico. Chico told you that we worked together, and what we did together was research basically on the consequences of the COVID pandemic, both on mortality and on economies, basically. And to assess the impact on economies, we were using figures from the World Bank, basically about the predicted impact on the poverty rate in different countries. And when working with this data, I was struck basically by the fact that Burundi, which was the poorest country in the world at the time, the estimated impact was actually of the COVID pandemic was predicted to be very small. And the reason for that is that basically in Burundi, most people are already poor. So shifting the distribution by 5 or 10% to the left, as predicted by the World Bank, didn't increase massively poverty. And that's because, of course, the poverty rate is not distribution sensitive. Okay? And so I thought, okay, I think it's possible to do better, and it's possible to create a measure that if you shift a distribution where the bottom is very poor, it's really reflected in the conclusion that you can. And so I started thinking about what is poverty according to me. And basically, I came to the conclusion that according to me, if someone has half the income of another person, that person is twice as poor. And so I constructed a measure based on this simple intuition. And actually, this simple intuition that I just narrated using the example of poverty, you can use it to construct measures that are relevant to other domains in physics, in sport, etc. And so let me start actually this presentation by an analogy with running, because it's useful to understand how this measure is working and the intuition behind the measure. So I think everyone would agree that someone who's running at 10 kilometers per hour is twice as fast as someone running 5 kilometers per hour. And conversely, this second person is twice as slow as someone running 10 kilometers per hour or miles per hour. Okay? So slowness, and actually in running we call that pace, is just the inverse or the reciprocal of speed. It's just 1 over speed. And that's typically expressed in the inverted unit. If you express, for example, speed in kilometers per hour, you will, so in basically a distance divided by time unit, you will express slowness or pace by the inverted unit. So typically in running, it's in minutes per kilometer hours. And of course, there is no threshold above which you will stop accounting for the speed of a runner, or threshold at bottom where the speed of someone doesn't count anymore. Okay. Also, this principle, like it also works with other multiples. Someone running at 15 kilometers per hour is 3 times faster than someone running 5 kilometers per hour, and inversely, the person running 5 kilometers per hour is 3 times as slow as someone running 15 kilometers per hour. And you have this kind of reciprocal relationship in physics. They are actually widespread. You have resistance and conductance, specific volume and density. They are widespread in physics and widely used. And my proposition in this paper is that poverty is just simply the reciprocal of income. And so the second question is then how to aggregate data on speed or slowness for a population, for example, for all the runners running a marathon, and similarly, how to aggregate income or poverty for a whole population, for example, in a country, in a region, etc. Okay? And so in the research, what I showed is that basically there is only one decomposable measure that is satisfying this intuition, and that is measuring average speed. It's basically average speed. Okay? And the only measure of slowness, aggregate measure of slowness that is satisfying this intuition is basically average pace. It's the only one that is decomposable in population subgroups. And basically the formula is simply the average of a series of factors, and the series of factors basically tells you what is the pace or what is the slowness of each of the runners. And these formulas simple formula, so average speed or average pace, they can simply be adapted to any context where you want to study cardinal quantities that range between 0 and infinity, whether it's distance, whether it's weight and lightness, or argue whether it's income richness and income poverty or income poorness. Okay, so this is the formula actually of income, average income poverty or average income poorness that I will discuss today. So it's very simple, and I will discuss why this measure should be used. And the first reason is because I'll argue it's intuitive. So there are two main interpretations actually to this new measure. And the first interpretation directly results from the fact that poverty is the reciprocal of income richness. Okay, with reciprocals, to understand the unit of measurement, you just invert the unit basically. And so its average income is measured in dollar per days. The new measure is simply expressed in days per dollar. So P is the average number of days that a typical person will need to get $1. You have seen in the formula that there is a constant Z that is included in the formula. What is Z? It's basically a constant that will determine the unit of measurement, but it's there also for average speed or average income and average poverty. Okay? It will basically determine whether you measure income in days per dollar or in dollars per day, in dollars per month, in dollars per year, in Kenyan shillings per day, etc. So basically, Z is the constant that will determine the unit of measurement, and it's there both for the measure of average speed or average income and average speed or average poverty. And so basically, depending on the unit that you choose for Z, P will be the average number of days that a typical person needs to get Z dollars. Okay, let me give you an example. With the World Bank data that we'll describe later on, we can calculate that people in Zimbabwe needed an average 2 days to get $2.15. $2.15 is basically the extreme poverty line of the World Bank. In Tanzania, they needed only 1 day, a quarter of a day in China, and only 1/10 of a day in the US. And so that shows the huge differences between different countries. And it shows also that this new measure has a simple unit. And so it's quite intuitive and can be easily used to express important differences between countries. There is a second interpretation of the measure, and that's the interpretation that we propose actually in the papers with all the World Bank colleagues. And basically, the measure is also the average factor by which incomes need to be multiplied to attain the reference level of income Z. Okay, so let me give you a simple example to explain this interpretation. And it's a simple example with 3 people. You have a first person, A. She's earning exactly the income A. So for her, her individual poverty ratio is equal to 1. You have a second person earning half the income of A. And for that person, the individual poverty ratio is equal to 2. And you have a third person with a quarter the income of A, and so she's 4 times as poor as A, so her individual poverty factor is equal to 4. And basically, to bring C to the income level of A, you would need to multiply her income by 4. Okay? To bring B to the income of A, you would need to multiply her income by 2. So what is actually the indicator that we are proposing is just the average factor by which income needs to be multiplied to reach the reference level income of Z. Okay, so 2 main interpretations, either in days per dollar, so how many days or years or months do you need to earn a certain number of dollars or another currency, of course. And the second interpretation is the average factor by which incomes need to be multiplied to attain the reference level of income of Z. And of course, like I haven't mentioned that yet, what value should you pick for Z? I mean, there is no precise rule for that. In some contexts, people prefer to express income in dollars per year. In some contexts, they express that in dollars per days. In some contexts, they express that in a dollar in another currency and another time unit. So there is no rule, but it will change a bit the flavor of the measure. Okay. Of course, if you tell people that in Zimbabwe, people need on average 2 days to get $2.15, that really shows that people are really poor in Zimbabwe. If you use a higher value of Z, I'll show later that with the World Bank colleagues, they are using the value $25, which is a higher prosperity standard. Then the flavor of the measure is more towards how much do we need to bring people to this prosperity standard. So depending on the value you pick for Z, you have flavor more of a poverty measure, let's say, or more a factor by which income needs to be multiplied to get to a certain prosperity standard. Yes?
So would you say that the choice of Z matters?
I think it matters from a policy point of view. I think it doesn't matter in terms of, and I'll come back to that, ranking and ordering population, countries, etc. It's just a scaling factor. So, for example, expressing average income in days per dollar or in dollars per day or in dollars per year, it doesn't affect how you will rank countries according to their average income, according to their GDP per capita. It doesn't change ranking, it doesn't change ordering, it's just a scaling factor. And that's exactly the same.
So it's sort of, it matters if the cardinal nature of the thing matters, right? It matters cardinally, but not ordinally.
Exactly.
But it would still be like a cutoff for poverty, right?
No.
But if you are using it in that end.
It's not a cutoff in the sense that people earning, for example, double the amount of Z, they still count in the measure. Okay, they will count for 0.5 because they will need 0.5 days to get the value Z. So there is no cutoff in this measure, and I'll come back to that. That's one interesting feature of the measure, I will argue, but that's also a controversial feature of the measure because it means that the measure doesn't satisfy the focus action. There is a specific point on that later in the presentation, so I'll come back to that later today. So the measure is also empirically grounded. That's another argument why this measure, I think, should be used. And so, as some of you might know, I've done an online survey, including with you, to try to understand how people basically understand poverty and how they make comparison between people with different level of incomes and how they would allocate income or extra income basically between people who have different incomes. And so I have different samples. I have a sample of experts with 245 respondents who participated to the seminars that I gave in different institutions, basically, and also at the LSE. And then I have a sample from the general public. Basically, I did online surveys in 4 countries, in Kenya, India, South Africa, and the US, online. And basically, they answered both the expert sample and general public sample, answered broadly the same questionnaire that you saw today. And of course, the questions were like, had the objective to check whether people's responses are in line with this new measure that I just described, or whether they are in line with other indicators that are already existing in the literature. And that's basically the answer from the first question. And the first question basically was explaining that the World Bank determined that it is impossible for a person or family to meet basic needs below an income of $2.5 a day per person. And that's basically the extreme poverty line of the World Bank expressed in current dollars. So you know that the current extreme poverty line of the World Bank is $2.15 a day, or was when the survey was done in 2017 dollars. If you adjust for price levels today, you get $2.5 per day, which is also easier value to make calculations. So that's why you see $2.5 in this question. And so you have two people, A earning $0.5 and B earning $1.5 per day. And the question was basically which statement corresponds best to how you describe the poverty of A and B. And basically, one of the first answer, like the order of the answers was randomly drawn. But what I call the first answer is that basically A is equally poor as B because they are both below the poverty line. That's the answer that corresponds to the poverty headcount. And you see that slightly less than 1/3 of participants preferred that that option, and actually no one from the survey among participants from this seminar provided that answer. There is also a series of like the largest number of answers actually corresponding to the new measure that I just described, or more or less 50% of the respondents think that A is 3 times as poor as B. There are also quite a few responses that are in line with the poverty gap and with the square poverty gap. And actually in the LSE survey, because I have the most recent data with me here, some people still replied today, so I could not include that in the slide, but let me just check. I think 80% of participants replied this answer, so in line with the new measure, and 20% basically of the participants replied in line with the poverty gap. Yes?
Going back to the question of the cutoff.
Yes.
You said the new measure, people who are above the cutoff would still.
Yes, it's not a cutoff.
Exactly. So you claim that you don't need a cutoff, but in this survey you always refer to this cutoff, and there were no questions for which you had both people above the 2.5-day poverty line. In that case, I would have expected that in your survey, people would say that none of them is poor. So the high
yes, I'll go back to that question because, of course, on purpose, I'll go back to that question later when we are discussing about the focus axiom. And also something interesting to note is that, like in the general public survey, a random subset of participants were randomly assigned to a questionnaire without this first sentence, so without any reference to a poverty line. And results are similar, if not stronger. Like to some extent here, I prompted participants to select this answer. I told them, hey, select this answer, that's the one you should select. And still, if you tell them or you encourage them to select this answer, most people think, oh no, I cannot answer that. It's not true. They are not equally poor. Okay?
But if you put something very high, even without a poverty line, if you put someone is earning $2 million per day, and the other one 2 million.
Yes, in the
both of them are not poor, right? So if you put a sufficiently high, then you
so
will have
I didn't do with millions, but I did also a random subset of participants earning instead of like with a poverty line in the US, with a poverty line equal to $50 per day, and the incomes when were therefore $30 per day and $10 per day, and we still get the same results. I didn't go above than that because that's not the purpose. You know, the purpose of this measure is to study low incomes, and even if there is misapproximation in the super high income, in any case, these people do not count for like very much in the overall aggregates. Yes?
What's a low income?
I mean, in this measure, and that's the interesting thing, is that poverty is something continuous. Okay? And in a way, what my research is showing is that there is scope for two, like there are two different views of poverty. One view which is more binary, and that corresponds basically to the poverty headcount, and to some extent, the poverty gap and the square poverty gap measure. Either you're poor or you're not poor. But there is also another more continuous vision of poverty. And so far, there is no measure that corresponds to that more continuous view of poverty because all existing measures are basically starting from the focus axiom. And so one contribution maybe of this research is to show that there is scope for a more continuous view of poverty that corresponds to not everyone thinks like that, but a substantial share of people think like that. And so basically what the research is doing is to provide one indicator that works well for that vision of poverty. Yes?
Sorry, a clarification question, the comment that is later. So you said that you are framing the question in order to suggest that A is equal to B, basically, no?
I mean, to some extent, that's what this framing is doing.
But to me, this really depends on the randomization of the answer, because if the first answer I get is the fourth or the fifth, I immediately see that you are looking for something which is continuous, because
Yes.
you cannot be put times.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I expect people to answer predominantly the fifth one, when the fifth one appeared before
Yes.
the first one.
Yes.
While if the first one I get is some obvious wrong, or the first one, I might select the first one. And so my question is whether you find a correlation between the order and the probability of selecting answer, and whether, because I'm sorry, I didn't.
No.
So I didn't know whether it was possible to navigate and change the
Yes.
answer.
So basically, the order of answers were randomized in 3 blocks. Actually, it was either this one first, or this one first, or this one first. So this one actually never came first, because it was easier to program like that, long story short. And basically, it makes very little difference, the random order of question. And that's maybe because actually this one never comes first.
Yeah.
Okay. If anything, it changes the percentage by 2, 3, 4 percentage points, but it certainly doesn't affect this overall conclusion that you have from this figure, that there are 2 visions. One, poverty is a binary status, and one, poverty is more like a continuum with different degrees of poverty.
Yeah. The second point, sorry,
Yes.
as quick as possible, is that so the fifth answer is in line with your measure, provided that the Z is 1.5, correct?
No, it doesn't depend on the Z, like this third answer. Basically, it's just that A is 3 times poor as B, and that's whatever the choice of Z. Like this axiom or statement that someone with 3 times the income of another one is 3 times richer, or the contrary, it doesn't depend at all on the reference point.
So what does change is the relative poverty of individuals with the same distance depending on Z.
I'm not sure I
So
understand.
when you move Z,
When
the
you move
relative poverty of individuals.
compared to Z will change, but that's basically the poverty gap.
No, but I mean, when you compare individuals between them, not with Z.
The cardinality will change, but it'll always be 3 times the other one.
Yeah,
Yes.
but the cardinality will change.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
No, pleasure. So we have similar results if we change the parameters actually. In the second question, A was earning $1, B was earning $2, and you still get 2 different views basically, and with some people preferring the poverty gap. And the results within this group were very similar. And we go back to that figure afterwards. So it seems that there is room for a measure that takes into account this continuum character of poverty. And what is nice also is that this measure, it has actually interesting properties. And one first property, and it's by construction of this measure, is that it's subgroup decomposable with population weight. What does it mean? It means that basically you can split general population, for example, the population of the world, into different subgroups. So for example, countries, and then reaggregate them using population weights. So basically weights that are proportional to the population in each country, and do that quite easily. And also subgroup decomposability is implying subgroup consistency. So something that will happen in one of the subgroups, or one country, will be reflected quite consistently in the overall aggregate at the world level, for example. And it's worth noting that it's a property that is not uniquely satisfied by our measure. It's a property that is satisfied by most poverty measure, but it's not satisfied typically by welfare indices like the Atkinson measure. A second nice feature of this indicator is that it's distribution sensitive. Basically, it's giving more weight to the pores of the pole. And there are different definitions of distribution sensitivity in the literature. We didn't invent anything there. Basically, some authors consider that the measure is distribution sensitive is it satisfies the transfer axiom. So meaning that poverty should increase if you transfer income from someone lower in the distribution to the income distribution to someone higher in the income distribution. You have another definition that depends on this transfer sensitivity axiom. So there you have two transfers that are made at the same time, one regressive transfer lower in the distribution compared to one progressive transfer of similar size. And because the regressive transfer is taking place lower in this distribution, poverty should increase if the poverty measure is basically distribution sensitive. And then you have a third definition, which we call growth sensitivity. Is basically the transfer axiom, but instead of transferring amount, you transfer percentages. And basically, if you transfer percentage of income from poor individual picture, you need to have an increase in poverty. So the measure satisfies these three different definitions. That's the case for here different for many welfare indicators, such as the Atkinson welfare indicator for at least some values of the parameters, but it's typically not satisfied by the most well-known poverty indicator, the poverty headcount, of course, but also the poverty gap doesn't satisfy these different definitions. The squared poverty gap satisfies the first definition, but it becomes very difficult to interpret. So a third property that is satisfied by our measure is that the orderings and the comparison that are made using the indicator do not depend on Z. Okay, and that's a very nice property because if you have worked with poverty data, you know that depending on the threshold, the poverty line that you will use, you might get very different conclusions. Okay, you might get different rankings, you might get a different perspective on whether poverty was reduced over time or not, depending on whether you pick a low poverty line or a high poverty line. With this measure, whatever the choice of Z you have is just changing the unit. The same for average income, you have the same for average poverty, it's just changing the flavor of the unit without changing the conclusion, the orderings, and the comparison. Okay. There is one property that this measure doesn't satisfy, as I've already said, is basically that this measure doesn't satisfy the focus axiom. Okay. Is this a problem? Of course, I argue that that's not an issue. It's in fact a nice feature of the measure. And I explain why it has nice consequences afterwards. First, I think it's not a problem because there is actually little evidence of discontinuity or little evidence of a sharp cutoff below which basically people are suffering much more than above the poverty line. Typically, people that are below the poverty line, they are suffering a lot, but if you remove some income from them, they are suffering even more and even more and even more. It's not that at one point there is a sharp non-linearity. And second, the survey experiments, the one that I did with you online and with other participants, they suggest that people don't really take into, like, they attach little importance to the poverty line. They don't really consider the poverty line when making choices. Yes?
No, yeah, I wanted to see them.
Yes. And so basically that's a third question that was asked to every survey participant is the same question, except that the amounts were different. And basically, A was earning $1 and B was earning $3, and $3 is above the poverty line this time. And you see that there is a change in the answer. Basically, most of the people who answered that A and B are equally poor, they shifted their answer to B is not poor. Okay, that's the answer that is consistent with the headcount, the poverty gap, and the square poverty gap. Basically, with all, like with the view that poverty is a binary status. But you see that both in the general public and among experts, there is still a large group that has a more continuous view of poverty and that thinks, okay, this person B might be above the poverty line, but I don't think the situation is easy for B. That person maybe is not as poor as A, but still the situation is still difficult. And so poverty is more like a continuum.
But
Yes?
here, it's just I don't get it very well, but if these three, I think I'm in this survey as B is not poor, but maybe I was a bit not sure. But if it was 30 instead of 3, I would have been sure saying B is not poor.
Yes.
It's not B is A is 30 times poorer than B.
Yes.
Have said B is not for sure. And I think you change a lot of the answers.
Yes. Yes. So yes, certainly to some extent I agree with you that when it's easier to have a binary view of poverty when the differences are more extreme, of course. Okay. And because the approximation, like in a way, if you have a continuous view of poverty, I don't know whether you have, or people who have a continuous view of poverty, in a way, the approximation that you make by picking a binary indicator or by making a binary choice like that is very limited, like the approximation that you're making when the incomes of people are so different.
But I
Because
don't think it's binary linear, but there's definitely a
Yes.
point in which there is a kink, a change, right? Like when you say, well, this person is not poor anymore, we're not
Like,
making comparisons.
I think it's useful to go back to the analogy and the analogy in terms of the people running. Okay, if you have someone running 5 kilometers per hour and the other one running 50 kilometers per hour, like the person running 50 kilometers per hour is 10 times faster. Like we all agree. Okay? Even the difference is super large. Is the person running 5 kilometers per hour slow? Yes, but still, speed is a continuum. Okay, and in the same thing, pace or slowness is a continuum, and the person running at 5 kilometers per hour is 10 times as slow as the person running 50 kilometers per hour. Okay, if you have to select which one is slow, it's easy. You would pick the one running 5 kilometers per hour. If you have to say is 5 kilometers per hour slow, in absolute terms, if you are thinking about a runner, you would say yes, maybe. If you are thinking about something else, maybe not. Yes.
I mean, at some level, but I've known your work for a while, and at some level, it's semantics. I mean, if you don't impose the focus axiom, you don't impose the focus axiom, and what you're doing is perfectly fine. I guess what people like Valentina and Javier are getting at a little bit is this idea that that maybe the concept of poverty, and you're trying to get at that through your survey, but then they're saying, well, you're incomplete because you're not going to the 30 or the million, the very high incomes. And, I think when you say, well, but this is about low incomes, which is why I asked you the question, you kind of betrayed a certain duality about that as well, in that in your own mind, there are incomes that are low and incomes that are not low. And that's what poverty is all about, right? So here's the question. What about if you use as an analogy BMI instead? Okay, and you take people who are, I don't know what BMI is, but 7 or 9, and you say 7 and 14, both of these are low BMIs. You would not say the 14 BMI person is twice as obese as the 7. You might say the 7 is twice as malnourished, but you would not use the word obese. And similarly, if you went to 35 BMI and 70 BMI, you wouldn't say the 70 BMI is half as malnourished. No, you would say they're twice as obese. And so I think the argument I'd like to put to you is that to most of us, poverty is more like obese and malnourished than it is like fast and slow.
I mean, there is a key difference with your example is that with BMI, you have a non-linear relationship between BMI and welfare, and you might have cutoffs. You might have cutoffs below which it's very dangerous actually to have a BMI that is too low or that is too high, and there is actually a non-linear relationship. To my knowledge and what I've, like the literature review that I have known, there is no threshold like that for income and for consumption, the less you have, the worse of basically you are. There are other dimensions where cutoffs exist, like for example, for temperature. For temperature, below 0 degrees, like water is turning into ice, okay? And above 100 degrees Celsius, water is turning into vapor. And so there, cutoffs are important, and it would be important to account for these cutoffs in a measure. You don't have something like that, at least according to the review I done, and the work of very poor people, including refugees. You don't have cutoff like that when studying poverty. I'd like to stop the question if I can, because I see that the time is flowing, and hopefully there will be time for question afterwards. Because there is this other important question, or series of questions, where I didn't ask people just to compare two people, but I asked people to actually make transfer between people, okay? And to say whether they actually prefer to transfer money to a poor person or to a richer person. And some of the question were, the parameters in the question were randomly assigned. And so some people received the possibility to transfer $0.25 per day to A or to B. And so they don't have the possibility to push A or B above the poverty line. And you see that most people allocate the money basically to individual A. And to some extent, that's in contradiction with the headcount and average income, where typically you would be indifferent between transferring the amount to B or to A or B. But then what happens for those who were randomly assigned to transfer actually $1 per day to either A or individual B? Actually, very little changes. And that's true for the sample of experts, that's true for the sample in the general public, and that's actually true also for the sample at the LSE. At the LSE, actually, you have basically 80% here, 80% here, and you have 20% here and 20% here. Actually, people don't take into account this possibility to push someone above the poverty line when they have to assign additional income. They prefer giving the money to the poor individual in line with the new poverty measure, basically, that I'm proposing. Okay, so that's for the general public. Of course, according to the new poverty measure, you need to allocate the money to A in both cases. There was also a qualitative question, but that was only for the questionnaire for the general public. I tried to keep the questionnaire for the expert as short as possible. It was the same preamble, and the question was there about qualitatively comparing individuals that are just above or just below the poverty line. And as I've already said, in the general public survey, actually had like a randomly selected part of the sample didn't receive information about the poverty line. And basically there you see that actually most people, when the comparison is really close to the poverty line, so between 2.4 and $2.6, they claim that yes, B is poor, but much less poor than A. Okay, so people still think, at least a majority of people still think, if B has $2.6, $6 or $3 or $4, the significant proportion of people still thinks that B is still poor to some extent, at least qualitatively, even though the person has an income that is above the poverty line. And that is then, of course, magnified if I don't provide information about the poverty line. Of course, you see that the trend is decreasing as the income of B is increasing, showing that after one point, people start hesitating, in line with some of what a few are suggesting as well. And then a third advantage of not relying on the first focus axiom is something that I've already told. It's because, or it's thanks to the fact that this measure doesn't satisfy the focus axiom, actually, that research, rankings, orderings do not depend on this threshold V, okay? And so that's really a benefit of not relying on the focus focus axiom, and I think it's an important one because it makes all debates about the value of the poverty line less important or less relevant. So then I'll argue that P is also relevant for policy, and I'll describe two different purposes for policy. First, there is a descriptive purpose. You might use a measure just because you want to describe the situation. And in this case, your measure should be intuitive, it should have nice properties, and then it should have minimal data requirement because you need to be able to implement it. And so I argue that the measure P is basically very nice for descriptive purposes because it has these different characteristics. Then you may also want to use a measure for normative reasons. For example, to allocate money between different people or for like guiding policies. And there, I mean, it's more difficult to argue that a measure is good for normative purpose because it depends on the underlying social welfare function that is behind the measure. And so behind P, what you have is actually utilitarian social welfare function, which is a elastic utility function. It's like a Atkinson social welfare function with a coefficient of inequality aversion equal to 2. And so there the question is, does it make sense to have a coefficient of inequality aversion equal to 2? Is this a value that is empirically grounded? And there's actually very little evidence on inequality aversion, and only few papers have tried to estimate the extent of inequality aversion between people. And most of the literature is actually coming from high-income countries, and it's involving typically trade-offs that are with high levels of income, and that's also related to the fact that it comes from high-income countries. And so in the surveys that you have done, but also that the general public has done and other experts have done, there were questions actually that were trying to narrow down the degree of inequality aversion of everyone. And this is the distribution of answer basically for the general public and also for the sample of experts. The sample size is lower just because I introduced this question after a certain point only. And basically what we find is that the average degree of inequality aversion among experts is very close to 2. Actually, the median is equal to 2, so neatly corresponding to the new measure. And it's a bit higher among the general public, but actually if you focus only on highly educated respondents in the general public, you tend to estimate that it's actually very close to the estimate that you obtain for experts. So if anything, in the public, people are slightly more risk averse than what is suggested by the new measure on average, but the median actually among experts is very close. So there is an interesting extension to this measure, which is an inequality index. Basically, if you replace Z by average income in the formula, you get a new measure of inequality, which has nice properties and nice interpretation. It has nice properties because it satisfies basically the transfer and transfer sensitivity axiom. These are properties that are not satisfied by all inequality measures, and certainly not by, for example, the Gini coefficient, which is widely used. And then it has intuitive interpretation, 3 interpretation. Let me focus on the first one because the other 2 interpretations actually are directly corresponding to the poverty measure that I just described. Basically, if you randomly select 2 individuals in the population, this inequality measure is the ratio, the expected ratio of their income. For example, in the US, the inequality measure is equal to 4.1. So that means that if you take into account 2 people randomly in the population, the ratio of their income will be 4.1. In Luxembourg, the average income is almost exactly the same as in the US, the average income per capita, but inequality is much lower at 1.6. So if you take 2 people randomly, the expected ratio of their income is 1.6. So I think it's a very intuitive and neat interpretation, which many inequality measures do not have, and many inequality measures do not have similar also properties. The inequality index also has nice decomposition properties. First, there is a neat decomposition actually between the poverty measure, the inequality measure, and average income. Basically, the poverty measure is just the ratio of the inequality measure and average income multiplied by the units. Okay, what does it mean? That means that changes in poverty can be fully decomposed into change in inequality or change in average income. Okay, so if you see a change in poverty, you can say, okay, that's because income have grown over time, or that's because inequality has changed over time. Okay, and another decomposition that you can find in the paper is that you can decompose the inequality measure neatly between group inequality and within group inequality. I'll not spend too much time on that, given that time is flying.
It's not exact, is that what you're saying?
It's because when you do, so if you take the log and you phase approximation due to the logs, but this is equal. This is exactly equal. So let me now show you some numbers, hopefully in 5 minutes. And basically, I'll take one example as an application, the fact that this measure that I just presented was actually adopted by the World Bank to monitor shared prosperity. So the World Bank has different objectives. One is to basically to end extreme poverty, and another objective is basically to monitor shared prosperity. And the idea of shared prosperity is to ensure that growth is reaching the least well-off in the society to address basically distributional issues. And so the measure that I just presented was adopted by the World Bank, basically to monitor shared prosperity. And that's what the World Bank is now calling the prosperity gap. And basically, it's the measure that I just introduced, where Z is selected as $25 per day. Why $25 per day? There are two justifications. Basically, it's the median, it's almost the median poverty line of high-income countries, and it's also almost the average daily per capita of average daily per capita income. Basically, when countries graduate from middle-income countries to high-income countries at the World Bank. And so you have this prosperity gap that, therefore, with the two interpretation, it measures the average factor by which income needs to be multiplied to reach $25, or it's the average number of days that people need to get $25. We use the World Bank data. I'll not go into the details, and this is what we find. We find that basically in 1990, in the world, people needed on average 11 days to get $25, and poverty has sharply declined since then because now people need on average 5 days to get $25. Thanks to the nice decomposition property of the measure, we can split this trend into contribution associated with different regions of the world. And we see that the contribution to poverty of East Asia, so basically China, India, and other neighboring countries, sharply declined over time, while the contribution, for example, of sub-Saharan Africa has remained relatively stable over time. We can also split the evolution in the prosperity gap into different components. So that I've said we can identify the evolution in average income, but also the evolution in inequality, which can be split in inequality between countries or inequality within countries. And what we see is that there has been a decrease in basically the what we call the mean gap, so the improvement in poverty if everyone was earning average income. We can also see a decline in between country inequality, and that's mainly thanks to the growth of China and India, but inequality within countries, if anything, it's really over time. We can also identify trends within countries, and so here I picked 4 countries with different stories. First, in the UK, since 1990, what you see is that the yearly improvement in the measure was positive. It improved by 1.3% per year, and that's mostly because of income growth. Actually, inequality increased in the meanwhile, and so that means that the contribution of the increase in inequality actually decreased the overall increase, let's say, in poverty. In Belgium, both inequality reduced and there was income growth meaning that the poverty measure improved by 2.3% per year, an improvement means a reduction in poverty in this case. In other countries like Zimbabwe, you have both an increase in inequality and a decline in negative growth, and so poverty sharply increased in that country. Maybe let me just conclude here by saying that we have a new nice measure that corresponds well to how a large group of people think about poverty, like a continuous view of poverty. It doesn't mean that other poverty measures should be discarded. We've seen that many people think also and like the binary view, but there is a new indicator for people who have a more continuous view of poverty with nice interpretation, nice properties, and it can be easily implemented in practice. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Paolo, we have a few minutes.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It was very fascinating, interesting. Made me think a lot. So I have a couple of issues. One is about zeros that really we cannot handle. We can calculate this in income, but only consumption, I guess, which is the same as in mean logarithmic deviation, which is very close to your measure, because it's your is mean deviation in the end, your measure.
Sorry, what?
When you transform it with the mean, is the mean deviation instead of the mean log the deviation, the measure.
For the inequality measure,
yeah,
yes, the ratio.
Which is
yes.
the same thing you have in the mean log deviation.
Yes.
In that case, you have the log.
You have the log, yes.
Okay, that is the same. I mean, you don't put a zero.
Yes, for any distribution sensitive measure, basically you have the issue of zero.
Yeah, so there is a zero probably here, but it's okay. The second, I wanted to elaborate a little bit more on this idea of this continuity. So you gave us the idea of the running. Or is it slow or fast? Okay, so imagine we live in a world in which we are all hunter, and we have to hunt animals that run at 4, 5, 6 kilometers per hour. And then there are predators that run about 4, 5, 6, 7 kilometers per hour. Then I get an idea of what is slow and not slow in this world. So I think our reaction is a little bit like this. We know that you need something to survive healthily, to acquire sufficient skill for a decent job, etc. And when we discuss about poverty, we think about absolute speed that can be problematic. And the last point is so to me, it's a super interesting inequality measure what you have. And I'm not sure at all that it's a poverty measure. So that my reaction is that it's an absolutely interesting inequality measure. I absolutely buy it from this point of view. But it's problematic as a poverty line. It's exactly because I do think that there are predators and
So let me ask you to just hold that, and I'll take two questions very quickly because
yes.
we'll have to end. One is a question online. There are a few, but Stella's going to pick one that you like the most.
Okay, the question is, how do alternative conceptualizations of poverty, which do not rely strictly on a traditional poverty line, influence our understanding of socioeconomic disparities?
Okay.
Read it again a little
Yes.
slowly.
Okay, sorry. How do alternative conceptualizations of poverty, which do not rely strictly on a traditional poverty line, influence our understanding of socioeconomic disparities?
Okay.
That's good. And then last question then.
Well, just to continue with the question online, yeah, for example, there are people that argue that poverty is not only about consumption, but also about the time that you kind of use, which you conceptualize in the way that interpretation is the days you need to get $2.5 and stuff like that, right? So how can you incorporate, for example, the free time that people have or the leisure that people have to account for other types of kind of poverty that are not necessarily economical poverty? And regarding the questionnaire on how things were phrased, for example, I think it's very clear when you say between $1 and $2. First of all, people know that it's a low amount of money, so they know it's kind of poor. But it's different if you ask between $20 and $30 or between 200 and 30. The ratio is the same. But of course, I know exactly that somebody that earns 230, I wouldn't say A earning $200 is twice as poor as B earning 300 because I know none of them is actually in poverty. And how do you think about this with negative incomes, for example? Would you say that somebody earning minus $1.5 is 6 times as poor as somebody earning like it's yeah, I don't really understand how to think about that question in that sense.
Yes. So let me try to answer a few of these very interesting questions, and I wrote them all to try to address them in the result. Maybe first about the negative incomes and the incomes that are equal to zero. The measure cannot handle incomes that are negatives or incomes that are equal to zero. And basically, in practice, what we did with the World Bank team to calculate this indicator for each country and also at the global level is basically to use bottom encoding. And that's a technique that is typically used by the World Bank and by other institutions that are computing similar statistics. Basically, they are bottom coding income, even if you might not realize it when you're seeing their data. And the bottom coding that we are using is $0.25 because it's the least expensive bundle, providing 2,330 calories per day. There are different methods that can use to try to obtain a lower threshold below which incomes are basically bottom coded, and results are more or less quite robust to the different bottom coding threshold that we could use. Okay, so here you see the same figure that I showed, but basically with different bottom coding threshold. Of course, that's a limitation of the measure, and as you said, that means that also the measure works better with consumption data or with data on calories, etc. And it can, for example, not be used with wealth or with assets because negative assets are typically possible.
You have to answer all the other questions in 1 minute.
In 1 minute, yes. Is it a measure of poverty or inequality or a measure of welfare? I mean, I'm sure that people might disagree on the terminology, and that's why in the slide, at least, I try to always refer to P and not mention that it's a measure of poverty or a measure of welfare or a measure of inequality. I really think it's a measure of poverty because, at least for me, and I think for many of the people who see poverty as a continuum, it corresponds well to my view of when I compare two people with different incomes, how I would compare their level of poverty, and correspond well to this idea that poverty is the reciprocal of richness, basically. But people might, of course, disagree with that and prefer another label. It's not technically a measure of inequality because it doesn't satisfy all the axioms that are required for an inequality measure, but the associated inequality measure is satisfying all these axioms, which is not the case for the Gini indicator, for example, and some other measures. So there is an inequality measure behind this work. I'm not aware of any measure not relying on any other poverty measure not relying on a poverty line. And so if there is any reference, I'm curious to get them. Incorporating other dimension, I think it's an important area for future work. There is quite a lot of work on multidimensional poverty. I guess some of this work is looking at leisure. I'm working for the moment on expanding this work for incorporating concern for mortality and health, but I'm sure that other concerns for other important dimensions of life could be incorporated. And then for higher amounts, I did like part of the respondent from the US got the question for higher amounts, and the answer are basically very similar and not statistically different. You can find the tables in the paper.
Thank you very much, Olivier, for a very thought-provoking talk. Thank you all for coming. Thank you. Please join us again in 1 week's time.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.